Today we'll be talking about digital marketing essentials. I'll probably talk for about an hour, so should be done by around 25 to 3, and there will be time for Q&A afterwards. But it's called essentials for a reason. I've found whenever you start talking about anything to do with digital communications or digital engagement, it's a lot like this scene from Malcolm in the Middle, where you start fixing one thing or wanting to do one thing, and then you realize that means you need to fix another thing or get another thing in place. And you just end up on this mad journey of almost fixing the entire organization, because you're saying we need to put some content out there. And they say, oh, who's it for? So you say, well, who are our target audiences? And we go, oh, we actually don't know. So your entire organization then needs to figure out your target audiences. Same goes for objectives, same goes for staff skills, same goes for time. It could be a giant topic. Why? I'm only focusing on a few things. It's not going to cover absolutely everything, but it's going to cover things that I think are useful. It still needs to include defining your audience, because really everything starts there. It informs absolutely everything you're going to do with digital marketing. I'm also going to cover tools, so many tools, the kind of basic building blocks you need to do digital marketing. And when I say so many tools, I mean so many tools. It's almost impossible to cover them all, but we'll do the most basic ones, the most useful things they can do for you and your digital marketing, including some other useful bits I've kind of just thrown in at the end, and how to make a plan, and then we'll end. So hopefully this will be a refresher if you're already up to speed with digital marketing. If you're starting from bottom or from the basics, then this should be a good introduction to some of the things you could do. And if you're a digital marketing expert, then you can make me look bad by asking me very difficult questions at the end. I've actually spent most of my career doing what I would call digital engagement, which is basically digital marketing, but phrased in a way that doesn't make curators terrified of you, because it uses the same tools, usually has the same sort of objectives. And in my mind, digital marketing is a lot more about bringing the paid side of digital engagement in. And that's the bit which people get most annoyed about, because everyone seems to hate adverts. But sometimes you get served the right advert, which actually makes you want to do a thing, like buy spicy chicken wings from Morrison's. That didn't actually happen to me. But the idea is you're trying to get the right content in front of the right people at the right time. And you're failing if you're getting the wrong content in front of the wrong people at the wrong time, or the wrong content in front of the right people at the right time, or you get the idea. And the way we can do that is by harvesting all of this lovely, lovely data, which is basically the bedrock of doing digital marketing. Data on who people are, what they do, what they like, and how we can use that to make sure that we're targeting the right people with the right stuff, whether that's paid or whether that's organic. But in terms of what the right time looks like, it's good to think of how we interact with visitors as kind of user journey through however they're living their lives, how you might reach them, not just in terms of digital marketing, but all the other touch points that they may have with your organization. I quite like this one from the Smithsonian, where people who are just about hearing about you might hear from you when they're planning their visit to the tourism industry, word of mouth. They may already get some marketing. Then when they're organizing their trip, it's how they actually plan that trip, how they arrive at the physical location, what that experience looks like, how they then share that visit afterwards, and then how they're retained as a person with a relationship with your organization. Which, put in a much more succinct way, is the classic marketing funnel. The idea that you are trying to push people down this funnel for this connection at the bottom, or just above the bottom, sometimes called a conversion, where you need to make people first aware that you exist, that you have an offer they might be interested in, that you then have content that, if they're interested, gets them to then consider doing something with you, and that consideration of how to do that thing is very clear. It's very clear if they say want to visit or buy a ticket, get something from the shop, or just learn something. That journey, say on your website, on your social media, or how to do that in person is very clear. Then they can actually do that thing, and then you're nurturing that relationship afterwards. So as a broad structure, that's pretty much it for digital marketing, but we're going to talk a little bit about how that actually works out in practice, which, as I say, starts with finding your audience and objectives. I put this in here first because you can try and find an audience for anything, but there's no point if you're, say, in the marketing department or doing digital marketing for your organization, if you're the only person talking about audiences, because you will have been, or you will be in the position, no doubt, in some point of your career of having to polish a turd because someone has created a product and have not thought about audiences whatsoever. And you're then trying to almost put round pegs in square holes. So like I say, can't go into absolutely everything in this 1 hour chat, but when you're defining your audiences, it has to be a whole organization effort. And there's obviously, there'll always be those arguments of how much of a creative risk can you take rather than just trying to pigeonhole everything by user personas or whatever. You do have to take some creative risks, but you should at least be guided in some sense by what your audiences want and need. I'm glad I found such a good picture for that as well. This is to Google, but saves me from taking a real life photo, which nobody wants. The ways of defining your audience, you may all be bored to death of segmentation, or you may be coming to it for the first time. But segmentation is just a way of, well, segmenting your audiences based on a particular lens, whether that's demographic in terms of their age or life stage, social grade, which always sounds a bit 1984, ethnicity and so on, or it might be geography, it might be behavior, it might be attitudes. It kind of depends on what your organization does and what it finds useful. And we always say, don't go full hog with segmentation if you haven't got a lot of time or budget, even if it's at the most basic level of we want to segment our audience by bookers or non-bookers, or people who live in our local area versus people who live a bit further afield. It's good to start somewhere rather than nowhere, because you can't usefully try and engage every single individual in the entire country or the entire world. You need to bunch them together in some way or form. Segments are a great way then of informing personas, which are ways of almost bringing those segments to life. But are very useful not just for marketing, but also for designing your website and designing your program. And it's what you do is essentially create a fictional person that represents that group. So you're not just saying X group, like we at the audience agency use audience spectrum, where you have like a metrocultural segment. You could have a person representing that segment, say Mark or Isabel or Keith, which is the name of my dog, and try to get inside their heads, ideally by actually talking to people of that in that segment rather than just making it up, to figure out what they actually need to do in their lives, what kind of things do they see day to day, what kind of online channels do they use and why, when they're potentially interacting with you. How can you add to their lives? What are their gain points? How can you help satisfy their wants, needs, hopes, and dreams? But also, what are their pain points? What are their fears, frustrations, and anxieties? And how can you make sure there is as few of those as possible in what you're offering and in your marketing? And these are great ways of almost testing or even coming up with content ideas in the first place. How do we do something that Mark or Isabel or Keith wants? God, I don't know why I'm choosing the whitest middle-aged people names in the world. My dad's called Dave, so at least I didn't go for Dave. But these are like the bedrock of everything I'll be talking about today, because without understanding how your audiences behave, there's no way you'll be able to design tactics to actually find where they are on the internet and give them content that they actually like and engage with. If you've segmented your audiences, if you made some personas, you're obviously not giving them all the same thing. You could use something called the Ansoff matrix, where you're looking at whether you want to do market penetration, which is essentially we already have this audience and we just want a deeper relationship with them. So it's kind of like more of the same, but better. Whether there's a new audience for an existing product. So you've got something you do already, but you think it might be of interest to another audience. So it's maybe repackaging it, different messaging. Or you may have an entirely new product, which you want to give to your existing audiences. Or you may have a completely new audience, new program, which requires entirely new messaging and new marketing. Just as a little splash of audience development in here before we get into the nitty-gritty. I'm about to talk about all of the tools, which is pretty much captured by this lovely diagram, which if you've ever been to any marketing webinar ever, you'll probably have seen this. It's still probably the best way of describing it though. The idea that you have your own channels, which is the stuff that you own, which is why it's called that. You control it, you can control the content you put onto it. You have your paid media, which is your advertising, things you pay evil tech bros to facilitate on your behalf. And you have your earned media, which is getting other people to talk about you and share your things. Today, I'll be talking about everything apart from these two weird things called media coverage and guest posts. Guest posts, because that's way too specific. Media coverage, because I don't do press, really. First, I'm going to talk about search engine optimization, which is kind of the bedrock of getting people to do things, getting people to your website to actually do the useful thing that they and you want them to do. And search engine optimization does my head in slightly, but its most basic is the process of making your website rank as highly as possible when people search for whatever you are, whatever you're promoting or selling. So like if you're the British Museum, you'd want to show up in Google or Bing, if you use Bing, as highly as possible when people search for the British Museum. And the way that Google rank websites is a bit of a dark art. There's a bit of AI in there. There's a lot of strange rules, which they sometimes tell us and sometimes don't, which is why I've got Skynet from Terminator here. But there are some things you can do to make your website show up more often for the things you want to show up for. And if you read a lot of advice on the internet, a lot of it seems to boil down to this. Even Google, when they do their updates to search engine optimization, this is essentially what they're telling us. And it's because so many people game their websites to beat the system. They stuff it full of content just so they show up and can get free advertising, even if they're not particularly relevant to what people are searching for. It's why now when I Google something, I always have to put Reddit at the end of my question, because someone on reddit.com will have answered my question better than whatever crap website has done SEO well enough to show up at the top of Google search results. And Google are realizing that this is slowly killing their business. And it's why they want more people to just do the best. They want people to know that the best way to show up in Google search results is to just have good, relevant content that people are searching for. But what does that actually mean in practice? Keywords are essentially the base of it. So the keywords that you're typing into Google also have to be included on your website. So when you're building web pages, you have to make sure that if you want, say, you're doing a post about how much you love Haribo, there's a packet of Haribo on my desk. I've had 2 packs of Haribo today. This is telling you what kind of day I'm having. A great day. You would want to have Haribo in the title of that page. You would also want it in your meta descriptions, which is, depending on your CMS, a description of the page, which would then show up in Google underneath the header. I'm going to show you all these in a second, but also your heading tags. So the same way, like in Word, where you have header 1, header 2, header 3 on your web pages, making sure that keywords are in there, but also making sure that the way you describe the URL slug, so the title of your page that comes up in the URL, has those keywords, but also makes sense. The length of content does also matter. Google likes that it's not just, say, a one-sentence page, but it still has to be relevant. You shouldn't really be stuffing the page with extra content just to reach an arbitrary limit. Because meta description should be short, clear, and relevant. Getting people to link to your website is gold dust. Why Wikipedia essentially beats every other website when you're Googling things, because there are so many links within Wikipedia and outside and inside. It's something that's telling Google that people actually think your website is useful and are visiting it. Also, your user experience is important. How long people are actually spending on your website, and whether your website structure is clear to Google, and whether it's actually loading fast enough. Lots of different factors come into it, but I usually just stick to the content and have a website responsive to mobiles. Kind of like, that should be standard now, really. So as an example, say if I wanted to find out how much wood would a woodchuck chuck, if a woodchuck could chuck wood, you can see here, first, there's a featured snippet, which is, like I say, we've only got an hour. There are ways for you to show up as this little featured snippet, but it's essentially Google's picking a website to say this is a definitive answer, which is based on a ton of factors. Usually, can you give a good enough answer using the right relevant keywords on a website that a lot of people visit in as short a sentence as possible, sometimes using structured data, which is almost even just lists sometimes. We don't have time to go into it. But here you can see the top results. Obviously, having the actual page title of how much wood would a woodchuck chuck helps. URL is also how much wood would a woodchuck chuck. And in the very first paragraph on the page, at the phrase, how much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood. I played a lot of Monkey Island as a child, which is what I'm referencing. If you haven't played Monkey Island, this makes no sense. But you can see this is an extreme example of if someone was searching for this very specific thing, there's a very specific page that answers that question that's very relevant. But the same goes for everything that you're posting about. You need to be putting yourself in the mind of people who would be Googling things that you were creating this page for. And one way of finding out what people are Googling, so you can make sure your pages have those keywords that they're as relevant as possible, is by signing up to Google Search Console. Because I don't know if you've ever gone into Google Analytics, Universal or 4, and tried to see what keywords people are using to get to your website, and it just says not set. And you're like, that's not helpful. Google Search Console does help a bit, but it's also quite fiddly to set up. I think there might be a WordPress plugin now, but you basically need to get into your DNS settings for your website and put a bit of code in there. It's actually not super difficult. It's more like a step-by-step, but it depends on whether you've got too many layers in your IT department, or if you're in a council, in which case you can just give up now. But if you do get into it, it does at least let you know what keywords your website is showing up for and which ones people are clicking. So it's a great way of saying, we're trying to get people who are searching for these kind of topics and phrases and keywords. Is our website working or not? Can we make any changes and see if we can improve that? And plus a lot of other things I won't go into. It's a very useful way of testing for whether you're showing up for the right searches. You can also use Google Trends, not really to see whether your website is working, but at least to see what people are searching for. You can also use it for planning content. It's not that useful, to be honest, but I thought I'd just chuck it in there. I was interested to see whether Boyzone or NSYNC were more popular. I think NSYNC were more popular because they're American. We also mentioned user experience. So there's no point having the most relevant web page if when people actually land on it, they don't find the answers that they want to, and they just leave and Google thinks you're a bad website. I've got a picture here of Hotjar, which is a tool you can use to see where people are clicking on your website, how far they scroll, and a few other things, which is quite useful to see whether people are actually finding the things you want them to find on your website and whether it's structured properly, whether your calls to action are in the right place. Like if you want people to book a ticket, is that button in the right place? If you want people to read an entire page, are they scrolling the entire page, and a user's engaging with the page for the required time. So if you've got an article that you know takes 3 minutes to read, if you're like spending 3 minutes, or they're just leaving straight away. So how you know it's working? Search engine optimization is definitely keeping tabs on Google Search Console if you can get that set up. And you could be keeping of your organic search and organic keywords through it. You could make a best practice template for your pages and stick to it. So if you've got a lot of people making pages for your website, just making sure they understand some of the search engine optimization best practice, which is essentially what I do. Like I set it up as well as I can and hope for the best, and then never check it again because I don't have time to keep tabs of every page on my website. Also, if you're on WordPress, there's some really good plugins like Yoast, which essentially tell you if you're doing a good or a bad job on your web page. I've got an example of that on the right here, telling you whether you've got the right kind of links, the right kind of keywords and key phrases, whether there's the right length, whether you've got a good meta description. I forgot to even mention having meta descriptions of images that actually describe what's in the image, which is what you need for accessibility as well. But that's SEO. Google Ads is our next fun one. You can see how dominant Google is over a lot of what we do. But Google Ads come in 6 different ways. They're the ads that show up when you search for something at the very top of your results. There are display ads, which are run across all different websites who are signed up. You can promote your products in the shopping section of Google. You can promote before and after YouTube videos. There are smart ads, which I've never really dug into, so please don't ask me about them. And there are discovery ads, which go across Gmail, YouTube, and lots of other places. But I'm going to focus more on pay-per-click, which is what the majority of people will be doing with Google Ads. And pay-per-click is essentially you're paying search engines for adverts for when people search for particular words and or phrases. So someone searches for the British Museum, you sponsor those words so that your website shows up when people search for it. You can create always on as well as specific campaigns. So you could have a campaign that just runs forever for, say, the name of your organization or for an exhibition that's in your permanent collection or whatever it might be. Or you might have a specific campaign for a particular run of the production, an exhibition or events or whatever it might be. It's called pay-per-click because you actually only pay when someone clicks. So you don't pay if it's shown to someone, you only pay if someone actually clicks on it and comes through to your website. But some words are more expensive to sponsor than others, so you can set a maximum for what you're willing to pay to sponsor that word. Obviously, if you want to sponsor the word pizza, there's a lot of people also bidding to give people adverts for pizza. But you'll probably be able to pay for an advert for Adam Koszary is a nice person. I don't think anyone's bidding for that. And it's not just useful for leads, so getting new people to come into your website, but also for protecting your brand from parasites who may sell tickets on your behalf. I was talking about this on Twitter earlier this week. If you search for a lot of heritage sites, like say Stonehenge or Pompeii, you'll get adverts from people trying to sell you tickets who are essentially ticket scalpers when the real website is actually down in the organic results. So it's also a way of making sure that those adverts aren't served to people, that even if someone would always, like if someone's Googling Stonehenge tickets, they're definitely going to buy tickets. So you might be tempted to say, why would we serve an advert to someone who is obviously going to buy a ticket? They don't need an advert, they're just going to find the website and do it. And this is why, it's because someone else might swoop in and try to sell them something different. I've even seen competitors sponsor adverts for their competitors' products. So if you're feeling really evil and you've got a local theatre or museum or gallery, you could sponsor their ads and get people to come to your place instead, which I would not condone. If you're going to do this, there's some key terms you're going to need to understand. We already talked about keywords. which is essentially what people are looking to Google. You need to have a bid, which is the maximum you want to pay for someone to click. And there's a quality score, which is essentially what Google scores your ads by how relevant your keywords are for your advert. And there's how your advert ranks against others who are also bidding for the same keywords. There's the actual amount you pay per click. And there are conversions, which is when someone has actually clicked your advert and gone on to take another important action on your website, which needs a bit of setting up on Google Analytics. Helpfully, Google Ads do give you a keyword planner, and you can sign up to this. Well, anyone can really sign up to this, but you can see what people are searching for, by what volume, and whether there's low, medium, or high competition for those words, and what the kind of cost is for those keywords if you wanted to bid for them. So it's not just useful for doing ads, but it's almost like another way of doing Google Search Console for seeing which are the most high volume key phrases and keywords. Also want to link it up with Google Analytics 4. I have this very helpful bullet point here, which says integrate Google Analytics 4 with Google Ads. Very helpful. There is a walkthrough guide, which I've also linked at the end of this presentation for how to do that. But the most useful thing you can do is by having your events and conversions set up in Google Analytics 4. So that's you telling Google Analytics 4 to tell you when someone does a particular thing on your website, which they're a bit fiddly to set up. And all events can become conversions. You're just saying a conversion is the most useful thing someone can do. So that could be that they've completed a purchase, or they've spent a specific amount of time on a web page, or the classic one is when they've landed on a newsletter subscription confirmation web page. That's job done, they've converted. Events can be what leads up to that conversion, just things like putting stuff in your basket and potentially getting to a particular page, whatever it might be. If you also have e-commerce on your site, you can assign monetary values to some of these events and goals as well to track, for seeing how valuable a page in an event is. But you can also track your acquisition from paid ads through to conversions in the advertising report tab. So when people are clicking through from those pay-per-click ads, you can actually see how many of those are and what they're doing. And if you're not doing this already, if you're a not-for-profit, then Google gives you free money to be paying for Google Ads. So each qualifying nonprofit has access of up to $7,000 per month in search ads shown on Google. So it's completely free. You just need to sign up with Google. If you're not doing it already, it's essentially free money for getting your organization out there in the world. So you just need to Google Ad Grants and get on it. Now we're going to talk about social media advertising, which is evil because social media is really just an advert delivery system. I'm going to be talking about Meta primarily, so Facebook and Instagram, because it's essentially the same process for all platforms, but also because it's probably the most valuable organization to be doing your social advertising on. And a lot of it works by inserting what they call the meta pixel on your website, which is essentially a cookie. It's something that can track when people have seen or clicked on your adverts, and you can track them through to your website and what they do and who they are. And if users accept cookies generally, then they can also be retargeted afterwards. So if they visited your website and they didn't buy anything, you can then send them an ad afterwards to try and push them back to your website. Essentially, you're kind of giving Facebook permission to track people based on the ads that you're giving to your prospective and current customers, which is fun. Also problematic because, well, not just for ethical reasons, but you may have seen that Meta are going to start charging for Facebook and Instagram verification ticks. Twitter's already doing the same. And it's because the advertising money is starting to level off. You can see here on the left, annual advertising revenue of Meta kind of dipped even a little last year. And then there's the fact that Apple is giving people control over, they allow websites like Facebook to track them across the internet. Google, I think they've delayed this now to next year, but they were also going to kill off third-party cookies, which track you around the internet if you're using Chrome. So essentially, all of this data is slowly becoming less and less valuable, and we'll gradually know less and less about audiences that social media sites are serving up to us for their advertising platforms. But for now, it's still a fairly accurate and fairly successful way of reaching people that you want to. The idea of reaching the right people at the right time with the right advert. I think a lot of advertisers kid themselves that they're good people because they say in the ideal world, you're only showing adverts to people who actually want to do the thing that you're advertising to them. And that might be the case for a lot of people, but it's still a bit of a odd art. But the first thing you'll need to do when creating adverts is to define that audience that you're trying to attract. And one thing that you could do is create a lookalike audience. If you have a CRM, say where people are signed up with their emails, Meta can use those emails and details to connect them up to their presence on Facebook and social media and understand a bit more about their interests and advertise to them if, say, you're trying to remarket to them. Or you can build audiences based on the kind of interest, behaviors, and demographics that you understand about your audiences. Going back to what I was saying at the very beginning about defining your audience, this is using that information to say that we're trying to attract, say, people in this locality with this age or with these interests. And there are tons of interests that you can target on Facebook. It's a bit profiling. When you're actually going to serve someone an advert, it's a little bit like pay-per-click actually, because whenever someone is, say, on Facebook or around the internet, they could be showing an ad, but then Meta runs this weird automatic auction on which ad is most relevant to show to that person. And sometimes your ad will be the most relevant one and it will be shown to that person, or it might not be. It depends on how well you've crafted your advert and the wording and the content and how well you've targeted that audience. But it means that you might say to Facebook, run this advert for a month and I'm going to give you 100 quid, but it might actually not spend all of that £100 if you don't win that auction often enough. But the steps in setting up ads is basically the same on most social media platforms. Building an audience profile that you want to target, those kind of demographics, interests and behaviors. You creating lookalike audiences if you can. So audiences which you're kind of sourcing from your other platforms like CRMs. You're setting an objective for that ad, say whether you're trying to sell something, whether you're trying to raise awareness, whether you're trying to get people to click through to something. You're setting a time span, whether it's going to run pretty much forever or whether it's time bound. You're setting a budget of the maximum that you're willing to pay for that advert. You're uploading your creative, which I'm just about to go into, and then essentially profit. But sometimes the ad may fail, sometimes it may do really well. That's why it's all a process of experimentation. Do you need to tweak your audience? Do you need to tweak your creative? It's all a learning process. And like I say, I would show you the process for the other ones. Twitter ads is basically on fire. It's pretty much the same process. You'll find that it's very similar also for YouTube, Instagram, Snap, kind of Pinterest, and TikTok. Obviously with YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, there's a bit more of a focus on video, and you're looking more at profile rather than landscape. The way we come to creatives for your adverts. You could just go for the bulk standard. It kind of depends on what you're trying to do with your ad. You could just be saying, here's a really interesting article that we want you to read. It could just be a text post. You could be doing carousels, which are a bit more engaging. So there's a bit more of a story to tell as people swipe through, and a bit more of an option to see what this advert is about, particularly if you're selling a product with an exhibition or performance, just a bit more context to give for the advert. You could be making things for stories or Instagram Reels or TikTok, going mobile first for your design. We're making it very striking, very simple. You could be doing video to make it a lot more dynamic, having those clear call to actions in there. Book now, read now, that kind of thing. And the trend is definitely more for the simpler, the mobile friendly, and making those calls to actions very clear. We're kind of past that time of just slapping a poster on social media that we would on a bus stop. Your ads should really be made for social media and digital. What to do when it comes to social ads? It all comes back to understanding your audiences, their motivations, what channels you're using, what do they want to do, determine what you're selling and how to fit it to those audience needs, including what kind of creative or messaging would work best for them. Determine your budget, obviously. Even if you have a small budget, you can just spend a tenner and see how it goes. To be honest, you don't need to be spending hundreds of pounds, depending on the kind of organization you're working for. But you need to keep track, you need to evaluate, and you need to keep improving. Things will never stay the same. Your audiences may change. Facebook will probably change how its system works. It does seemingly on a weekly basis. But you need to keep improving. You need to be asking yourself questions like, say if your ad budget is being spent, but nobody's actually converting, you probably need to review the user journey. Does your call to action to make sense? Is where you're sending them on a website, is that a clear user journey? Do people understand what they can do when they get to that website? Could you be testing other creatives? Those kind of questions to ask if things aren't doing so well. Which brings me to earned and out of paid ads. Finally, I've got a slide on influencer marketing because I feel like it's fallen out of fashion, but also I think people have very different ideas of what influencer marketing is. I think it's almost like an unfortunate name for what I've used it for in the past, which isn't necessarily, say, paying Kim Kardashian to talk about a cultural event, but it might be working with people I know who are respected or even involved with a production in a certain community, or I know that are not cheerleaders, but spokespeople and role models for the kind of audiences that we're trying to target. It's not necessarily always the Instagram influencers that are in our heads when we hear the word. It's just people that are respected and listened to by the people we're trying to reach. And you should always remember that you're paying for access to that audience and a recommendation for someone that audience trusts. So this goes back to who's the bigger audience you're trying to reach and who is influential with that audience. When you're involving an influencer with what you're doing, you've got to be very specific in your brief, whether you're trying to achieve sales or awareness or just participation. Be very clear that is what you're trying to do, where you want people to end up, whether there's a hashtag involved or a link. You can't just say do a post about us, basically. But also influencers come in many shapes and sizes. You don't necessarily need an expensive one with tons of people. You could just say use an academic, but an academic who has a very engaged audience could be much more valuable than another. And I'll be talking about UTM codes in a second, but you need to find a way of actually tracking the success of what people post if you're paying them to post for you. UTM codes are a great way. You could also be tracking hashtags. And again, I'll be talking about how you can do those two things in a second. Also on-site activations, which is more trying to give people an opportunity to share their experience while they're on site with you. Not necessarily just to post their experience on social media, but say to sign up to a newsletter or whatever you might want them to do. I feel a bit bad for this actually, but I was doing some work for Museums and Galleries Edinburgh, and this is the City Art Centre in Edinburgh. And it's right next door to this bar with this kind of insane frontage, very colourful, lots of flowers. And I think you could guess how many more people were taking selfies in front of Bohemia than there were in front of the City Art Centre, even though it's essentially the same kind of buildings. But Bohemia obviously know how to make a splash and how to get people to take pictures in front of them. I'm not saying you need to do what Bohemia has done for your site, but it's something you need to consider, not just in marketing, but when you're crafting an experience. How can you make something quite striking that might be an activation for social media, potentially? But it's also the classics of putting online reviews for your front of house, on leafleting, which you still kind of need to do, follow-on emails, performances, particularly if you're like a museum or a collection, sorting out your photography policies, make clear when it's encouraged and how people can share it, and making sure, like I say, those social media opportunities are considered early in those planning processes, not right at the end when they say, how can we get people to put this on Instagram? You need to be asking that at the beginning of the project. Also, going back to the polishing a turd analogy from the beginning, having a good experience probably solves most of this from the beginning, but it means that people need to understand that you need these digital engagement and marketing opportunities considered from the beginning as well. And just to touch on those online reviews, because they are make or break for a lot of people. I don't know about you, but whenever I'm in a new place, I essentially just use Google Maps to find out where to eat and where to visit and what to do. And that decision is basically decided for me by the mad people who do Google Map reviews. I've reviewed 2 places in my life. One of them was a bike shop, which is now closed, and one of them is a dryer laundry, which I'm fairly sure is a money laundering front. Both because I was really annoyed. You don't need to know this. But essentially make sure you're signed up to Google Business so you can manage your information and those reviews. And TripAdvisor is the devil. And I kind of get the impression it's also sort of on the way out. It's really been overtaken by Google now. But you need to be there if only so you can combat inaccurate reviews and respond to valid complaints, because otherwise they're left there to fester. And now, e-newsletters. I've actually only got one slide on this, which I feel bad for, because I think newsletters are going to be even more critical in the future when those third-party cookie changes come in, because newsletters are going to be one of the only ways you can say, I know exactly who this audience is. I know that they're interested in this topic or interested in us, and we've got a direct line to them to say, here's what we've got to offer, here's ways of entertaining you. I've only got a little bit of advice. One is definitely consistency. It's not something that you can just pick up and drop off every now and then. If you're going to have a schedule, stick to it. If it's going to be monthly, make it monthly. It's going to be weekly, make it weekly. But just make sure that people understand that this is going to be something in their inbox on a particular day, ideally around a particular time, every 2 to 4 weeks, whatever it might be. Which isn't to say that you can't send a special one when something special has happened. It's like George Orwell's rules of writing. Just disregard any of this if it's stupid. But also be valuable. And this isn't just about you selling to an audience. This audience has subscribed for a reason. You've got to make that reason really clear. What are they going to get out of this? Why is it going to be important and valuable to this person to sign up to your newsletter? And being very clear about what this newsletter is and is not. I sign up to Reading What's On because I just want to know if something good happens. Because I've been burned in the past when a favourite band has turned up and I didn't realise that they were in Reading. And I don't really want like this example of the Nick Cave newsletter here on the right, which is Nick Cave just responding to questions. That's all his newsletter does. I don't need that kind of content from Reading What's On. I just want a list of what's on. And that's what that newsletter gives to me. And that's good. You need to be clear on the audience and that need. If your newsletter is just about selling tickets, you can go for the jugular. If it's a bit more than that, then well, it's a bit more than that. But you just need to keep that consistency and that value. You should redraft, test and retest your copywriting too. It almost comes back to those SEO principles. You need to have clear headlines, clear first sentence. It's always going to be accurate if you don't want angry emails back to you. But it's something that should be constantly be evolving and getting more succinct and obviously mobile friendly. Organic content, which to me, it can still have this connection and conversion, but I always feel like you're going more for the awareness and interest with organic content. And that's because obviously with organic content, it's got that name as opposed to paid because you don't pay for it. which means that you're at the mercy of the algorithm, particularly when it comes to Facebook and Instagram, or you're just broadcasting to literally everybody who happens to be on their phone when it comes to platforms like Twitter. And that makes it a lot more difficult to handle, because at least when you pay for an advert, you can be fairly confident that you're reaching a very particular audience with it, and it should be relevant to that audience. With organic, you're putting it out there into the world for the widest possible audience, which means you need to think about a lot more deeply about which audiences you're trying to cultivate and the kind of content they would click off of their own free will to read and enjoy. Which is why I think a lot of it comes around this awareness and interest. You're trying to get the story of your organization out there to get them interested in you, so that they then might do those kind of valuable things, like buying a ticket, visiting, even watching a video, whatever that connection might be. So you can think of it as brand. You need to know what topics you post about and who for. You can't talk about everything. You should talk about what's just valuable and interesting about you and your organization. You should be testing different formats to see what works. And you should understand that people have various motivations and interests online. I've got this matrix here on the right. I hate using the word matrix, but the idea that people variously want to be entertained or educated, or you might be wanting to convince them to do something with you or inspire them about what you do. And it's not necessarily saying you should do only one of these things. It's a mixture of things, depending on your objectives. We talked about the funnel. But the big thing, if you're doing digital marketing as a main job, is when it comes to organic content, it's not just about selling. It's about giving people a reason to be interested, because you're broadcasting to such a large audience, but also because people on social media and on the internet are not just thinking, I want to buy a ticket to something. They're thinking, I'm bored, I want to waste time, or I want to find out something interesting, or want to educate myself, whatever it might be. You're satisfying different needs to get people into a relationship with you, so that they then may be interested in those conversions, which actually are very valuable to your organization. I don't know if I'm explaining this correctly, really, but essentially, organic content strategy is much bigger than just pure marketing. It's almost like the entire representation of what you as an organization do, but online. But it is also quite a handy test bed for messaging, which may work for paid ads, which I've definitely done in the past. Testing a load of different things for organic, whatever kicks off, I assume will probably work well for paid as well. It means you need to get into that habit of this kind of life cycle of having kind of hypothesis about your audience and designing something for them, publishing it, evaluating it, and then just building on it. I'm conscious I'm almost going to run over my hour, which I promised. So I'm going to go on to other useful bits, a bit of reporting, and then we're going to finish. Honest. Some other useful bits is definitely the A/B testing. Most e-newsletters have this as an option, but it's something you can also play around with on your website and your social media content. It's essentially creating two different types of content with different messaging, potentially a different image, potentially a different call to action, potentially a different design of a web page or an e-newsletter, and then serving them to an audience to see which performs better. With e-newsletters, you can do this by actually sending one version to half your audience and one version to the other half. With social media, you might just try one post one week and a different type of the post the next week and see which does better, which is a bit less scientific. But it's a good way of confirming, or it's the opposite of confirming. I'm unconfirming a hunch, rather than just assuming that something will work or doesn't work. So you can try this with creators and content, also times of day and different days for publication, and your different types of calls to action. I promised I'd explain what a UTM was. So if you've ever clicked on a link and there's a load of crap at the end of the URL, that's more than likely a UTM code, which stands for Unique Tracking Urchin, I think. You don't need to know what it's called. All you need to know is what it does, which is it tells you exactly it can tell you when someone has clicked a link, exactly where they've come from. So say you're trying to get people to pablopicasso.org, you can put a UTM code at the end of it to say exactly where its source is, which in this case is Facebook, but could variously be a website, different social media channels, also how it's getting there. It's medium. A medium would be social, email, organic search, paid advertising. Why it's getting there, so you can give it specific campaigns. In this case, you could have an exhibition bucket and then a term specifically for this exhibition. I explained this really badly actually, but essentially this is a way of saying, on Google Analytics where you get, say, it tells you got so many visits from Facebook, but you don't know exactly which posts they've come from. It just says they've all come from Facebook. This is a way of you making sure that when you do a post, you can say exactly this many people came to our website from this Facebook post, because Google Analytics will tell you that they clicked on this link, because this link will show up in Google Analytics. And which I've got an example of here on the right from the audience agency website. So there's these big buckets of direct organic traffic, whatever. But also below that, we have this newsletter campaigns from some of our newsletters, the Digital Snapshot, our community forum, the amount of people who click through to our website from those specific campaigns for that month. So it's a way of tracking how well things are doing compared to each other. And I've got a load more resources on this I can send you if you'd like, but Google does have an online tool where you can build these campaigns yourself, but you need to be very clear on your terminology and how you describe your campaigns, because like here with the campaigns and exhibitions, ideally all your exhibitions would have that as a campaign term, and then your content term would be about each specific exhibition. I could go on off a massive tangent, but it's a way of, the short answer is it's a way of just knowing exactly who clicks on the links that you put out into the world and differentiate it from your other traffic. I'm going to throw in a bit of YouTube as well, because most people can take full advantage of all the tools you can use. You probably have seen end cards on videos that you've seen online, but they're a very good way of getting people to click through to other videos and to subscribe to your channel. You need to remember YouTube is a search engine, so you should be optimizing your content as you're optimizing your web pages in terms of titles, descriptions, and images. Images are interesting because I don't know if you know the YouTuber Mr. Beast, but he's recently said that he has a team which tests about 20 different thumbnails per video, which I don't think anyone has the time to do. But the idea that you never truly know what's going to kick off. You should always be optimizing and testing and seeing what works. And my last useful is magic time trick, where if you sacrifice your childhood best friend to Beelzebub and get endorsed by Satan on LinkedIn, you can unlock unlimited time and resource for your marketing activities. And I found that this is the main thing that people want from their digital marketing or from their colleagues. So please do that, but don't tell the police. I told you to do that. Reporting, which I'm not going to dwell on for too long, because again, it could be another hour. But I think people get too het up about reporting. It's because social media channels and Google Analytics and these other tools we use give us a ton of data in a way that perhaps other areas of the business don't give us this amount of data. And you're then tempted to report on every single thing that they tell us, whether that's engagement rates, engagement time on the website, sessions, UTM codes, whatever it might be. So usually I have a slide in here saying, don't just report on the numbers, go back to your objectives and only report on what is actually useful for saying you achieved that objective. But that said, I also recommend baselines as well. So you're not constantly trying to improve, but you say have a baseline average of how you performed, say, last year, or for another exhibition or production, and you're seeing whether you're performing above or below that baseline, and then seeing why, and then seeing whether you can improve. Stop and results with data. Obviously, possible baselines could be ticket sales, could be visits to your site. You could try and calculate return on investment, particularly for paid ads. Like if you have a budget and people click through to your adverts and end up buying something, how much money did you make for those sales based as opposed to how much you spent on marketing? That's a very simple return on investment. And obviously things like social media engagement as well. Another way you could look at it is by going back to the engagement / marketing funnel. Let's say if you're trying to measure how well you're doing at each of these stages, going through and seeing how that's reflected in the kind of tools you use. So for your awareness, you could be looking at your search position for SEO for particular keywords, or the impressions and reach of your social media. For people actually interested in what you've got to offer, you could be looking at web traffic to particular pages, maybe people visiting your social media profiles. For people considering to do a thing, could be social media followers, could be people signing up to emails, more engagement, more search volume for those keywords. And then the conversion itself could be that purchase, download, page engagement, people spending a particular time on a page and visits to your site. And that retention of people coming back to make repeat purchases, potentially becoming members, if you're doing surveys, getting a net promoter score, or people sharing your stuff online. And I've talked a lot about Google, but I haven't actually really given you a Google Analytics 4 slide, which obviously everyone is switching over to in July. But you should at least have some basic events and conversions set up in Google Analytics 4, just so you can say, this is the most important thing we want people to do on the website, and this is how people are getting to do that thing, or how they're not getting to do that thing. Ideally, set up a UTM structure for all of your links, so you can know exactly where people are clicking on. You could consider setting up some kind of template in Looker Studio if you find Google Analytics 4 a little bit too intense. Here's one I was working on yesterday. It's a way of kind of saying, I only want to see this thing from Google Analytics 4, and I hate clicking on everything just to get it. You can set something up in Google Looker Studio so that it only shows you the data that you want to look at most often, and just print that off as a report every month. So the idea is not to just have this data there, but it's to use it to make your user journeys better. If people aren't making it to your conversions, have a look, why are people falling off at a particular page? Is that page designed properly? Are your adverts working? All those kinds of questions. Social media, if you can afford a social media management tool, then tagging your posts is incredibly powerful just to see how well particular campaigns perform against each other. You could also be using social listening tools, which don't just look at the performance of your posts, but the performance of, well, how many people are using keywords that you're searching for. So say if you have a particular exhibition hashtag or a particular phrase, like the name of your institution, you can get these tools to tell you how many people are using those phrases and hashtags across the entire internet, essentially, and can give you things like sentiment analysis, but it's an inexact science. But using that data, quite like using the pyramid principle, where you have a situation, complication, a question, and an answer. So you have a situation where your data is telling you something, that something is happening. You want to complicate that situation, like what is that data not telling you? Say if your data is saying that, say you're trying to attract a particular audience, but that audience is not reflected in your social media following or your website visitors, then why is that? Why are they not coming? What might be underperforming? How might you solve that complication? And then what are the kind of tactics you can use to have a go, have a test, and solve it? It kind of comes into making a plan. Where the classic is, I mean, you've probably seen this in a million things. The idea that you're setting objectives, defining some KPIs for those objectives, if it's relevant, designing your tactics, doing your campaign, measuring what happens, optimizing the results. There's a bit missing in this diagram, which I need to put a link in for actually, where you need to actually define the audiences alongside those objectives and defining KPIs for those audiences. But it is essentially that you have an objective which sits outside. Well, it can sit outside of digital, but you're trying to achieve something which is quite broad. You make that a bit more specific. Who is it for? How do we measure success? Based on what you understand of the audience and the kind of tools you've got at your disposal, what kind of tactics do you take? You fulfill those tactics in your campaign, you measure how well it went based on the objectives you set, and then you use what you learned to do better next time. So you could work backwards if it's easier from that objective. This is an example that we had from the Royal Academy. I think a real example for a summer exhibition during the pandemic. We were trying to drive sales for the summer exhibition, trying to provide virtual access for audiences who can't make it. We wanted this particularly for our members and for young art lovers, which were a segment. So we designed some content that met those objectives, measured by these kind of metrics. You could also think in terms of always on campaign and reactive. So your always on is making sure that you have consistent, regular content, probably mostly organic, but it's also making sure that, say, your SEO is covered, that you're doing Google ads for your main topics in the name of your organization, and they're tied to kind of broad brand goals. You could have campaigns then for very specific exhibitions or events with their own paid ads, organic content, all the rest. But then you also need to be open to the reactive things that happen in the world, those events and trends, which you could respond to with stuff from your website, from your content, even with ads. And I think that means we're at the end. The ways you can get started, it's essentials. It does start with knowing where your audiences are and where to reach them. You need to test hypotheses about your audiences. Most people are starting from scratch, but you're saying, we know this audience likes and is interested in this thing, or they hate this thing and don't like this. What if we try doing X, Y, and Z to test that? You should get your basics sorted, make sure that your SEO is actually working properly. But it's also your governance of how you make all of this work, how you make sure you're early in that process of campaign planning in your organization. They got the processes and reporting sorted. Ideally have a system for each campaign and always on, so you're not just making it up from scratch every time. If you have an event or a production or whatever, we go through this process to make sure that all our bases are covered for that. But otherwise, keep iterating. You also don't actually have to do everything. I know people here will be from small to large organizations. It's whatever you can do and get away with will always help. But I do have some resources as well. The presentation will be sent around. There will also be a survey for this talk, which would be very useful for me for you to fill out, because I always feel like I always try something slightly different in each talk, and I'm never sure what quite hits and what doesn't. But also I obviously write, I write the Digital Snapshot, which is the audience agency's newsletter on what is changing in digital every fortnight, where you can keep up with some of these changes with paid ads and organic content and just things happening in the sector.